the Redress Fund Ordinance.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move a bill. I need to find the words. Yep. I move to introduce a bill for the Redress Fund Ordinance 2018.
Is there a seconder?
Yes, it's seconded by the Right Reverend Dr. Chris Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Oakley.
As I was thinking about what I was going to say, I thought, can I get away with a speech that was as short as the one I gave last night? After all, it is a fairly simple decision that we need to make today. Probably not that simple. But I do want to reinforce that the decision that we need to make today is a simple decision, and that's because it's a decision about a process, not a decision about an outcome. Mr. President, what members of Synod are being asked to do today is to make a decision about what process do we adopt as a diocese to provide sufficient funds to fund redress. Synod is not being asked to make a case-by-case, line-by-line decision on each of the buildings in the list, each of the funds in the list, each of the parishes in the schedule. Synod is being asked to look at the broad principles that are in play and to think, is this process that is set out in the bill robust enough, widespread enough, and fair enough so that in December, when Diocesan Council meets, all of the parishes and communities will have been able to contribute to this process so that we can make a decision based on sound reason and firm evidence in December. When this proposal was put together, it was put together quite rapidly because we needed to respond quickly to information that we received from actuaries who had put together, done some research for us on the amount of money that we needed to be able to fund redress. As you know, the National Redress Scheme starts on the 1st of July. As you know, Tasmania has recently announced that they will join the scheme. This doesn't mean that the Tasmanian government is going to pick up the tab for us. What it means is that they have opened the door for us to join the scheme so that we can do justice by survivors of child sexual abuse. We know that it will start very soon and that we will join very soon, and we know that the bills will start to roll in very soon. One piece of information that the actuaries were able to give us is that based on the most likely evidence that we have and the most sound reasoning that we have, we will probably see most of the funds expended in the first 3 years of this 10-year scheme. That means that we will most likely need to pay out $6.4 million in the first 3 years of the scheme, with the balance to come in the 7 years following. We need to move quickly and we need to act decisively so that we can properly fund this responsibility. So as the proposal was put together, we looked at the sort of principles that really need to underpin that proposal and our response to redress. Number one, we needed to make sure that we were active in funding this liability. We can't make a decision as bills are coming in to think, where on earth are we going to get the money from? Number two, our liability arises from the actions of people who were members of our church historically, who were members of our church all over the state. As one body in Christ, as one church, it was important for us to share the load of funding redress. This wasn't something that was going to be isolated to parishes where abuse occurred, perhaps, or isolated to a few hotspots where resources were bountiful or where ministry was scarce. This was going to be shared across the whole diocese. Number three, we wanted to make sure in the midst of all of that, that as far as possible we had a light touch on ministry and mission. That as far as possible the proposal that comes before the Synod today, that's worked out over the coming 6 months and that comes before Diocesan Council in December, allows ministry to continue across this state. We don't want to see areas of devastation as far as that's possible. And then finally, number four, we wanted to make sure that the decision that Diocesan Council makes and the process that Synod adopts is one that is based on reason and evidence. As Christians, we are people who respond to reason and evidence. We don't believe on the basis of somebody's word. We believe because of the eyewitnesses that saw Jesus rise from the dead and reported it and recorded it. We believe because assessing the evidence through reason and rationally, we see that the best explanation for the world as we see it and for the accounts in the Gospels are the truth of Jesus' resurrection. We are a people that believes in reason and evidence and acts according to reason and evidence. And this is the part of the fundamental basis for this particular proposal. We want to ensure that the process delivers the best evidence that we can and the most rational and reasoned decisions that we can. So how did we come by this particular process? As a diocese, and I use that word to describe all of the parishes in the state and the central administration together. As a diocese, our wealth is primarily not in cash or in the operational budgets of our units, but it's primarily in real estate. Primarily it's property that it represents the wealth of the diocese, and therefore it's property that gives us the capacity to fund this sort of liability. And so we looked at some of the funds that are held with trustees on behalf of parishes and on behalf of the central diocesan administration that were representative of property sales from the past, where we've sold land that we don't need, or churches that we don't need, or a campsite that's become built in and becomes unusable. As we put those funds together, and this is where I pray that the slides work. Excellent, they do. As we looked at those funds, the blue and the, is it peach or is it orange? Orange. As we looked at those funds and looked to levy 25% of the value of those funds, we came up with $2.8 million from diocesan property funds, the central administration, and from property funds held by parishes from past property sales. So we were getting there. The next logical place to look is those parts of those real estate holdings in the state that we're currently not using. It might be a building that's been closed because there's no longer a congregation there. It might be vacant land that we've inherited from the past that we've never done anything with. It might be a building that's no longer fit for purpose and stands empty most of the time. As we looked at that, we had a list of property that was surplus to requirements, property that now is not used and logically would be available to sell and to fund redress. But when we did that, there wasn't sufficient property in that pool, and so we had to look further afield. And as we looked further afield, we looked to those buildings that did not meet sustainability criteria. Now there's a little bit of a misconception that I think I need to confront here. The misconception is this, that somewhere in the diocese, we sat down and came up with a bunch of criteria, plucked out of the air, that we said these parishes aren't sustainable, and therefore we're going to target these parishes or these buildings. That's simply not the case. The sustainability criteria are about reason and evidence. The sustainability criteria have been derived not from a think tank in Hobart, but from research that's been done all around the world in the Anglican Communion, in Canada, in the UK, more locally in the Diocese of Newcastle here in Australia. Looking at what are the measures by which we can see this parish has a sustainable long-term future. What are the hallmarks that you see in a congregation or a church or a parish that says in 50 years' time this place will still be here and this ministry will still be operative? And so those criteria were things like the number of people who attend, 30 household units. How much live giving is there? Is there enough live giving to fund full-time ministry? Does this place have the capacity to fulfil the governance requirements? That's the requirements at the local level to take proper care of property, of finances, of oversight of ministry, all of those sorts of things. Is there a plan for church growth through evangelism and through reaching children and young people? Are there regular meetings at this place? Weekly services is the hallmark. Is this place able to meet all of the costs of running? Now, this isn't some set of criteria by which we stand in judgment. This is a measure of reality. This is a measure by which we say, if these hallmarks are met, then based on that evidence and the application of reason and experience, we will see that place still doing ministry, still serving the gospel, still reaching people for Jesus in 50 years' time or in 100 years' time. And conversely, if many of these marks are not met, what reason tells us and what the evidence shows us is that the likelihood is that there will not be anything left there in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. So these criteria are not about judging what's happening at the moment. These criteria are about applying reason and evidence to, is it likely that these buildings, sadly, may become surplus to requirement in the not too distant future? We pray that we are wrong in that. We pray that ministry is revived. We need to act on reason and evidence. As we apply those principles across the buildings in the diocese and the parishes in the diocese, we come up with 25% of the expected value of those sales, currently surplus to requirements and possibly surplus to requirements in the future because of unsustainability. And that brought $4.7 million on our estimates into the Redress Fund. That's the yellow wedge that you can see there. And then finally, the direct contributions. And that refers to parishes where we stood back and looked at the application of these objective criteria and said, it looks to us like these few parishes are affected either not at all or are affected very lightly by these proposals. It looks to us that these parishes have some resources that they could contribute. And so therefore we approached the parishes directly and said there will need to be a contribution. And that's reflected in Schedule 3 of the bill. That's the grey wedge. That brings in another $1.1 million, which funds the complete amount of what we expect our liability to be on the most likely scenario given to us by our actuaries. One of the big questions that we're asked is this. We're expecting $4.7 million to come in from the sale of properties. But when we look at the value of those properties on the government valuations that we've been working to, it's 19 point something million dollars that those properties might bring in. Why is it? Why is it that we would sell more property than we need to fund that yellow wedge, that $4.7 million? And the answer to that question comes into, the answer to that question is the third principle that I enunciated, which was that as far as possible, we want to see ministry and mission continue across the breadth of the diocese. This is what the breakup of the proceeds of sale will be. And then I'll move to explain what we're trying to avoid. The total stack in that chart represents all of the money that will come in, 100% of the money that comes in from property sales. The top 25%, that yellow redress percent, is what would go into the redress fund and then be available to fund our responsibilities under the National Redress Scheme. Current policies quarantine off 25% of property sales, so that's the grey and the orange bands there, into a new ministry development fund. Now, the new Ministries Development Fund is a fund that's administered centrally in the diocese. It generates interest, which we then expend by grants to local parishes to do new ministries. They're supporting things like the church plant down at Southern Beaches. They're supporting things like the regeneration of the parish of Circular Head. They're supporting initiatives where parishes are starting to reach out to children and families for the first time, and so starting to work towards some of those criteria for sustainability. So the interest off the money that goes into that fund is available across the diocese for anybody in the diocese that comes up with an idea for some new ministry. The orange section is a section that is reclaimable by parishes. So if my parish sells $100,000 worth of property, that orange section represents 15% of that, $15,000, that sits in the new ministry fund generating interest. But in 5 years' time, we have a fantastic idea for a new ministry that's going to reach new people. And we think some funding for that would be great. We can apply to Diocesan Council to ask for that $15,000 back to seed directly into new ministry. That's something that applies to every parish in the diocese. And so part of the proceeds of the property sales is then able to be claimed back by parishes. That's that orange proportion. The blue proportion, the parishes retain. So of the buildings that are on the list, of those that are sold, half of that money remains invested with the trustees for the local parish to use. As the local parish thinks about how are we going to leverage this money to be able to provide ministry into the future, what will we do with that to build ministry in our local place? That money's there available for them to call on. The reason, therefore, that we didn't want to apply 100% of the proceeds of sale of a quarter of the buildings on the list was because then there would be none of that money available for the local parish or for the development of new ministries across the diocese. We wanted to ensure that we honour those two principles, that we are funding redress and doing justice to those our church has harmed in the past, and also that we're ensuring that there are some resources available locally for ministry to continue. As we've travelled around the state talking about this idea and consulting with parishes in the lead up to Synod, one of the big questions that we've been asked is, surely there must be another way of doing this. Surely there is a way of coming up with the $8 million that means that we don't need to sell properties. We love our properties. We have history with them. It's a place where communities meet. Isn't there some other way of doing it? There have been a number of themes that have started to come through, or suggestions that have started to come through. We've considered, is this something that we can just fund out of operations? There are some dioceses in Australia that can do that, but we are not one of them. If you've read your estimates booklet or your accounts booklets, you'll see that the Diocese of Tasmania runs a very tight ship. We have been running deficit budgets for a while, and we simply don't have the operational revenue to absorb $8 million. $8 million represents something like 4.5 years worth of diocesan budgets in the central office. And there's simply no way in operations that we can fund just under $1 million a year, $800,000 a year, to pay for the redress scheme. Could we take out a loan? That's something that's been suggested. And every time we test any of those assumptions, we find that it's very difficult. If we took out a loan, we still then need to come up with the operational budget to repay the loan. We need to deal with interest. We need to think about, is it likely that we would get a favourable rate of interest? Interest rates are low at the moment, but it would be contrary to reason and evidence to proceed blindly on the idea that interest rates will stay low or remain favourable. And I've already alerted to the fact that we considered selling fewer properties and using more of the funds from that sale. And the reason that we rejected that, we want to ensure that ministry remains possible across the state as far as we can. So let me turn to the process. I'm having Carolyn hand out the papers that are on the edge of the desk there, because the flow chart that will come up on the screen is more or less illegible. So I will speak through it. I can read it perfectly on this screen here, and my apologies for it being so difficult to read. This either is or will be available on our website shortly, and there are copies available. There's only one for each table, I'm afraid, and then there'll be a handful of copies for the media. Essentially, we have already been through the green bubbles up there, which is some of the in-principle decision from Diocesan Council, and the Diocesan Council endorsing the proposal that has come before the Synod today. We're now at the first diamond. on the second line of that process, which is where the Synod either adopts the ordinance or doesn't. This is a decision point where Synod is being asked to endorse and adopt the process in the bill, or to say, do you know what, James, we have a better way of doing this, and this is it. If Synod says no, then the proposal doesn't go through. As the President indicated not so long ago, if we vote no in principle, we move on to the next item of business, and we need to come up with another way of funding redress. If Synod votes yes, then we enter into a stage of consultations that involves the central diocesan administration, that's the middle line, that involves the parishes, second from the bottom, and that involves the community external to the church, which is at that bottom row. There are some supports available for the submission preparation. So we've been speaking with experts in parish leadership, in ministry and mission, who are willing to make themselves available to help parishes think through what ministry looks like and how they can put together submissions to the Diocesan Council. We've been speaking to property advisors who can give information and advice about how properties might be developed, how we might be strategic and wise in the way that we steward our resources there. And we've got advice from valuers. We've got access to other advisors as well, and so if local parishes say to me, we really need somebody to help us with this, we can start to access that. The idea with this part of the process is, as far as possible, we want to tailor the proposal to local circumstances. From the diocese, we need to do something that is more or less one size fits all. The way Just Jeans will do a range of jeans, it's the same cut or few different types of cuts. We make a rough assumption that everybody's built roughly the same. There's a little bit of tailoring there. But for anybody who doesn't fit that mould, and my wife is one of these, she finds it very difficult because she's not very tall to find jeans. There's always a little bit of tailoring that needs to happen, and so she gets them taken up. The idea locally with this consultation is that parishes are going to look at this one-size-fits-all policy or process and think, actually, we can fix this to suit us better. That might be, we don't need to sell all of the buildings that are on the list for us. We're going to keep this one and give more from these other ones. Therefore, that works for us locally in the parish. Or they might say, when we look at this, our buildings are actually too isolated for us to be able to sell that and still maintain ministry. We're going to ask for an exemption because we're an isolated, remote, rural parish. And there are criteria around that. It might be that there's some other creative way that parishes will come up with to do ministry. I've had a fantastic, I can't believe I'm going to say this, I've had a fantastic month in May, believe it or not. I've been on the road quite a lot. It hasn't all been beds of roses, but I have been able to meet with some inspiring people. People who are in small parishes that look like they may lose every single building in their parish. And where there are people who are thinking, do you know what? We have a relationship with the school across the road. We do breakfast club in there. We go and help kids in there. We provide breakout space for the school. If we were to meet in the school hall, how easy would it be to start to integrate with that community that we already have connections with? I'm travelling and seeing parishes who are starting to think, do you know what? In our setting, in urban Tasmania, we have a parish that is a church that is literally 5 minutes walk away from us. Maybe we can partner with them and work together with them and work strategically across our urban landscape to think about how we can do ministry well. That is a good sound. We are speaking with people, as I said, who are thinking we can think carefully about what buildings we actually need to keep for ministry, and so we can then be flexible about what else we're doing. And then we don't need to worry about maintaining the fabric of that building anymore. We have opportunities here. So for those reasons, I say it's been a fantastic month, because I'm starting to see, in amidst the pain and in amidst the anxiety, some great ideas and some exciting thinking about how ministry might work into the future for the Tasmanian Church. In a moment, I will finish. They all breathe a sigh of relief. And there'll be a time for questions. But I do want to just sound 2 notes of warning before I do. Number 1, Synod, we have a responsibility to do justice to those our church family has harmed in the past. That is our shared responsibility. That is one of the things that God says in Micah is true religion and is required of you, to seek justice and to love mercy. I know that this is scary. I know that this is emotional. But what I urge you is not to vote down this bill unless we can come up with a better way. Unless reason and evidence drives us to a better process or a better decision, don't vote down this bill on the basis of fear or sentiment or emotion. Secondly, this is a matter for you, Synod, but I would urge you not to approach the list in Schedule 1 in a piecemeal manner today. You have that power. We can go through building by building, line by line, and make a vote. But if we do that, we will be abandoning the principle of gathering the best evidence that we can and making a decision based on reason. There are parishes that I have spoken to who are fearful for the future because they fear losing all of the buildings in their parish. I can think of 2 that I met with this last May. One of them has already sent in their application for exemption to me. They see that the process of pulling evidence together and providing for a reasoned decision in December is the best way forward, even though, as we sit here today, the outcome for them is uncertain. There is another parish that I've been speaking with who have said much the same thing. They are thinking through how can we retain the building that is the core of our parish at the moment, where our people meet. How can we retain that and fund redress, but do that in a reasoned, evidence-based way in December? And as I speak to representatives of that parish, they're hopeful that we won't have a week worth of emotive speeches in the Synod today as we go through line by line, building by building. Because the best outcome, not just for the local parish but for survivors of abuse, is that we adopt a process based on reason and evidence. And so finally, Synod, you have a simple decision before you, but a weighty one. What I ask is that you step up to it, that as you debate and amend, that you look to make amendments that will strengthen the process, that will enhance the quality of the evidence and the quality of the decision making in December, so that that process can best advance those twin goals of funding redress and doing justice, and of supporting continuing ministry in the diocese. I commend the bill to the Synod.